Dear students, welcome to the exam revision session. We want to look at some past papers today. We are actually looking at April 2024 paper 1. After this, watch out for the next paper 2, which we will also review. One of the best ways to be best prepared for this exam that is fast approaching is to study as much questions as possible. Knowing the answers are not enough. Getting to know why the answers are the right answers are very much more important. So the instructions need us to answer all the questions, to use our black and blue pen. If you need to draw diagrams or work on graph, you use a pencil. Your center number, candidate number, and other details need to be well provided. Ensure you don't use correction fluid. For those that are used to correction fluid, it's not permitted for this exam. And the barcode, you are not to write on them. If you need any other thing, you'll be provided. But most importantly, you need to be in the exam with your own calculator. Paper 1 is going to take 50 questions, and here we go. Here's the first question. The question is about transport of water in plants. You should by now remember how water is transported within the plants. This question is testing your knowledge on that. Let's start with the first question. Looking at the diagram, the question is asking you what exactly is happening at the stage X. We can see clearly from this diagram that at stage X, water is being absorbed by the roots. But then, the question is asking us beyond that. The question says which cells is absorbing this water. So you need to start thinking about the cell in the root that does this absorption. Of course, that is root S cells. Be assured, if you write root alone, you won't get this mark. The next question, what is the process of transport of water through the Y? The water ascends in plants through some vessels that are called xylem. Just a recap, water alone do not travel through the xylem. Mineral ions are also dissolved in them. So please take note of that. Mineral ions also passes through the xylem. The next question is Z. What is the process by which water is released from the surface of the leaf? The process is simply called transpiration. And this water here is not leaving the leaf in a liquid form. It's actually in a form called vapor, water vapor. So that process is called transpiration. If you have written evapotranspiration, or you've written evaporation, or you've written diffusion, the masking will still consider you correct. The B. Water is added to the plants and it contains minerals which provide healthy growth. So the question is, one of the minerals is magnesium. So the question is, which other mineral is also necessary for plant growth? Nitrates. So just to recap, magnesium is needed in plants to help form the chloroplasts or the chlorophyll, whereas nitrate is needed to make amino acid. And remember that combination of several amino acids form what we call the proteins. This process happens by what we call assemblage. So just try to remember that. Then the question number 2 is about periodic table. First of all, we need to remember that periodic table sometimes can be given in parts like this. Some other times, you may need the entire periodic table in order to get some information needed. So, periodic table, we remember arrange elements in periods and groups. Periods are the horizontal rows, while the groups are the vertical column. So I use the letter G to represent groups and letter P to represent the periods. Just a quick recap before we answer the question. Sometimes they can need you to identify any randomly chosen element by their groups and periods. So, for example, oxygen, I put the arrow on that, belongs to group 6 and period 2. So remember, if you move from left to right on this periodic table, we are talking about period. And if you move from up to down, you are talking about groups. So remember, you can identify each of these elements based on their groups and periods. You may pause the video to quickly see how to identify some other elements. Now back to the question. Write down the symbol of the elements with atoms that contain 6 electrons. Well, if it's an atom, number of electrons and the number of protons are the same. And remember also the number of protons is the atomic number. So if you look at the order of the elements, the first one is the hydrogen, helium is second, then I move to the next period, lithium, that's the third, beryllium the fourth, boron the fifth, carbon is the sixth, sorry. So the sixth element is what we are meant to identify because they clearly say the needed element with the 6 electrons. That means the sixth element. So having known that, the correct symbol is C. Now listen, it is symbol, not the name of the element. So you can see that symbol is clearly written in bold here. So please, when you are solving question, it is very important to pay attention to those details as given in the command words using the instruction right there in the question. So we'll move on. The next one is about the electronic configuration. They gave us the electronic configuration of chlorine. Well, these are the numbers of electrons, which when added together should give you the atomic number of the element. For example, for this chlorine that is given here, the configuration, if you add up the total number of electrons here, it should give you the atomic number of chlorine. So if I add up all of this will give me 17. And of course, that's the atomic number of chlorine. Atomic number of chlorine is 17. So it is very important for us to remember this when writing electronic configuration. Now, another rule you need to remember is each of these numbers represents each of the shells. Well, you may be familiar with the shells in configuration going in this form, and these shells are meant to contain the number of electrons. So we can have several number of shells depending on the atomic number of the elements. For example, chlorine, we have first shell taking 2, second shell taking 8, and the third shell taking 7. For us to complete the 17 atomic number or the number of electrons in this atom. So the question next to us is we should find the electronic structure of potassium. First of all, you need to know the position of the potassium. If you can't use the table correctly, if you don't know how to navigate, maneuver your way using this table, you can as well use the periodic table attached at the end of this question. So potassium is the 19th element. So you need to arrange the elements, electrons correctly. So the first share should take maximum of 2, as you can see here. All subsequent shares you should consider using 8 maximum. It can be more than 8, although it can be less. So when you fill up to 8, that shell is filled up, you go to the next shell. So that's how we arrive at 2881. So that's the electronic configuration for potassium. We move on to the third question. It's about density. You need to remember the formula of density is that's mass over volume. Exactly what the question wants you to do. You are meant to tick a sentence that correctly identifies density. And when we say mass divided by volume, we can as well say mass per unit volume. So that is that about the density. Now the next question continues, adding more to density. We have oil floating on water. How is that possible? How did that happen? That is exactly what the first question is saying, the B question here. They want us to explain how the oil is able to be on top of the water. So they need you to use the right words, the key words to answer these questions. So the first thing you need to know is that the oil is floating on water. So you need to use the word flotation. Okay, that's causing the first mark out of these 2 marks. The second one, why is it floating? There's a reason, a condition for flotation of any substance at all on another. The condition is the density of that substance must be less than that of the other substance it will float on. So for oil to float on water, it's because the density of oil is less than that of the water. That's why the flotation can take place. Well, just a recap, density of water is 1 gram per centimeter cube. Just know this, try to remember it. Questions on this may be asked some other times. Question number 4 is about inheritance, about genetics. It's about sex identification. Before you proceed, the first thing you need to know is Punnett square is used in genetic crossing. It is usually it usually helps to predict the offspring that will be formed from 2 different parents. Now, They've given us the genotype of the chromosome of the first parent as XX. Of course, you should know that is a female because XX represents a female individual. And then they need you to identify the chromosome of the other parent. Don't be too fast to conclude it's a male or a female. The Punnett square should guide you on what to write. So if the first one is XX, of course, you know there must be X at the upper column to give the XX. Then on this other one, if you have XY on the second or the first row, second column, XY means that X chromosome must have interacted with Y chromosome. So with that, we're able to place the X and Y chromosomes exactly where they belong. But the first question wants us to write them down, and that is 1 mark. So the parent 1 is having XY chromosome. The next question is talking about fertilization, where they talk about fusion of male and female gametes. Of course, there is a fusion of these gametes to form the zygote. So fusion that happened here has a name which I want us to remember. The name is fertilization. So fertilization is a fusion of male and female gametes, but you can equally remember that in the entire cell that form the gametes, it is the nucleus that is most important here. So it's actually fusion of male and female, the nuclei of male and female gametes. So please take note of that while we proceed. So the question says, what word describes cells like eggs or sperms? Now, the question I want to underline, a very good command word you need to remember here, word, not words, word. So the answer is gametes. You can as well write gametes, but if you are tempted to write sex cells, which can also mean gametes, okay, you need to know that this is not a word. These are words. And you know the questions say word, not words, okay? So you need to be mindful of that while you answer question. Please go directly on what is required. If you write reproductive cells, again, those are 2 words, again, out of the point. So please pay attention to the use of keywords. You need to remember that you may have an idea of an answer, but if you don't use the right keywords, you may miss the entire mark. Question 4b. Smoking is one factor that affects development during pregnancy, fetal development. So which other factor can affect fetal development? A variety of answers may be correct here. Your teacher will have to use his knowledge of science to determine whether or not your answer is correct. But diet is one common example. A pregnant woman not feeding well may have a fetus not growing well. The same thing with drugs. A pregnant women are men that are usually told to stay away from certain drugs because these drugs can affect the offspring or the development of the fetus. So other factors may be possible, other answers may be correct. It depends on how well you are able to reason it out. The next question, question 5, is about tectonic plates. Okay, tectonic plate is a very usual question that comes out in a science checkpoint. I would advise you take your time to go through tectonic plates again. The movement is usually represented diagrammatically using arrows either pointing towards each other or pointing away from each other. It has a lot to say about what is happening. So the first question says, there are places in the diagram where you can see the tectonic plates moving towards each other. There are other places where you see them moving away from each other. So you can easily look at the diagram and fish out your answer to all these questions. The first one is talking about Nazca and South America. So going through the diagram, look at the Nazca plate here, look at South America plate here. If you look at them very well, you can see that the arrow from Nazca plate is pointing towards South America, and the arrow from South America plate is also pointing in the direction of the Nazca plate. That means they are pointing towards each other. That's how we were able to tick the arrow of pointing towards each other. Then for Indo-Australia and Pacific plates, let's look at what is happening there. This is Indo-Australia here, and then we have the Pacific plate here. You can also see the arrow pointing towards each other. So looking at the diagram will help you identify the direction of movement of the arrow and identify your answer correctly without making any mistake. Let's look at the next one, Indo, Australia, and Antarctica. Look at the arrow again. The arrow of Indo is pointing away from Antarctica towards Indo, Australia at one point, pointing away from that same plate, the tectonic boundary, towards the Antarctic plates at the other end. Both arrows are pointing away from each other, so that makes us to know the right box to choose. So I think this is very clear from the diagram. So if you do this correctly, you get 2 marks fully. The next one is about formation of the moon. You need to, it's about the volcanoes. So the question is, where do you have most volcanoes pointing towards? Where do you find them most? Okay, the first one says they are found around the tectonic plates. Another one says at the middle, another one says at the Antarctic plate, the other one says African plate. Let's go back to the diagram. The diagram shows that most of them are aligned around that line. The line is actually the tectonic plate, and that answers the question. That's why we take the first one that says they are around the boundary of the tectonic plate. Let's go to the next question, 6. This question is about the reaction of metals with acid. There is a general trend about how metals react with acid. But mind you, metals that are higher than hydrogen in the reactivity series, they are the only ones that can displace hydrogen from the acid. We will remember that all acids contain hydrogen in them. So that hydrogen will be displaced by any metals that try to react with the acid, provided the metal is higher than hydrogen in the reactivity series. So that leaves us with the conclusion that anytime metals react with acid, a gas will be formed, and this gas is hydrogen. So let's take note of that. Let's remember that. So now let's go to the first question. The first question says you should identify one result that is anomalous. Anomalous means does not fit into the pattern. Then the second one says we should draw the line of best fit, which is a curve actually. So we have tried to draw the curve, and then we identify the anomalous result. If you look at that point we circled out, that point does not fit into the pattern we have. We already see the pattern of the line, the curve, but we can see that this point is actually deviating far away from the pattern. So that makes us identify it as anomalous. So anomalous result is meant to deviate away from the pattern. The next question says we should predict the volume of the hydrogen that will be formed in 3 minutes. Again, we go back to the graph. And in the graph, we have to draw a line from the 3 minutes. We go all the way up to the graph. I'm sorry, my line may not be straight. I'm just trying to draw something close to that. And then you trace it to the volume of the gas produced. So if you follow the diagram I just drew now, we can see that it's pointing at 60. So 60 watts. Please let me just remind us that if you are picking any value from a graph, we should remember the units and take the unit along. So if you go for 60, we should remember that the unit is cm cubed. So the unit matters a lot. Sometimes in the question, they may provide the unit for us like they did here, but it's not every time. So sometimes they need you to provide the unit yourself. So please, let's be mindful of that. You may be permitted to make a slight mistake. A slight mistake of taking half square or half of a square away from the value. That means if you have written 60.5, you might have been marked correct. If you have written 59.5, you might also have been marked correct. So, but if you can be precise, why taking the chances, why making the mistake of picking a wrong one or close to the right answer? Number 7 is about method of heat transfer. I hope we remember conduction, convection, and radiation. I think I tried to make some notes on that down here. So if you forget, you need to quickly go back there and quickly review them. So there is an hypothesis made, having looked at this diagram. Oliver made an hypothesis that water is given temperature by the flame. That means the flame is providing or is increasing the temperature in the water. Is that correct? Okay. Well, sometimes we used to make an assumption that temperature and heat can be used interchangeably, but I'm telling you now that they are not the same. They are different in so many ways. In the definition, heat is a form of energy, temperature is not. In their units, Heat is measured in joules, temperature is measured in degrees Celsius, degrees Fahrenheit, Kelvin, and so on and so forth. In the definition, temperature measures how hot or cold an object is. So the fact that the water already have a particular temperature before the flame even added more heat to it does not mean that it wasn't having a temperature of its own. So this one says, the hypothesis says that it was given temperature by the heat. That statement is completely wrong because it's meant to be heat energy is added onto it, okay, by the flame, not temperature. So that also answers the first question, which says we should tell why the hypothesis is wrong. I think that is good enough. So you can talk about the temperature, not necessarily about giving heat, by looking at its definition, or you talk about the heat energy being added from the flame, not the temperature. So the B says, name the heat transfer that causes the handle to get hot. The handle is made of solid, right? So if you remember the definition of conduction, which says transfer of thermal energy through particles but in direct contact, you should know that we are talking of something like solid. You put one end of a solid at the fire, the other end you are holding it. A metal in particular, a metal, which can conduct heat fastly. So your hand will soon start feeling the heat because the heat travels through the solid particle, which are in contact with each other before reaching your hand. Okay, so let's remember that if we have forgotten. Number 8 question is about the carbon cycle. So we are talking about carbon cycle here. Some processes are involved in carbon cycle. There are processes that take away carbon from the atmosphere, okay, and there are some other processes that return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Let me tell you today that only one process takes away carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and makes use of it by the living organism, especially the plant. That process is photosynthesis. Every other process returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, except the processes that distribute carbon within the living environment, which happens within the food chain. So let's answer the first question. The first question says, name the process that releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It can be respiration when we breathe out. It can be combustion during burning, especially of fossil fuel, and then it can be decomposition. During decomposition, carbon dioxide is also produced. So any of these is correct. That's just 1 mark. So one answer is expected from you. The next one is about the process that happens when during carbon cycle, when microorganisms break down carbon compound. This is called decomposition. If you call it decay, that is also acceptable. Then the third question here, C. Which process in the carbon cycle moves carbon dioxide along the food chain? That's feeding. So the carbon is present in the plant after photosynthesis as in form of glucose. So when animals like herbivores feed on these plants, they get the carbon incorporated into their own body during feeding. If carnivores feed on the herbivores, again, the carbon is passed on like that. That's how the carbon is passed across the food chain. The which process makes glucose? Photosynthesis, using the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I believe we remember this as we proceed to the next question, which is question 9. Question 9 is about extinction. It's one of the most recent questions that have been coming up from time to time. So please take note. You need to remember this and quickly review them. So the first one says how many mass extinction have happened during in the last 500 million years. The graph have the answer to your question. So all you need to do is to go to the 500 million years and look at where you have the maximum peak there. And you can see that it's corresponding to 5. Okay, 5 what? 5 extinction rates. So that is where we get our 5. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Increased volcanic activity is one cause of mass extinction. Suggest why an increase in volcanic activity can cause mass extinction. Okay, now they wanted to tell us the stage that happens after this volcanic activity before it leads to death, mass death or mass extinction. Okay, the mass death that makes some organisms to stop to exist. Okay, so looking at it, one thing that happens with volcanic activity or volcanic eruption is that climate will change, and then more carbon dioxide will be produced. That will give rise to what we call global warming, or we can say greenhouse gases are produced. Greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, right? I hope you remember. All right, so that is enough to answer the question. Varieties of answers may be correct as shown in the diagram and in the script, in the marked scheme. Question number 10. Mike makes some metals. We have the table speaking for itself. So the question is, which acid will react with copper carbonate to produce copper sulfate? The first thing you need to know is that the sulfate in the copper sulfate is from which type of acid? It's from sulfuric acid. So sulfuric acid has sulfate in it. That's where the name sulfuric is coming from. So that is where we got the name sulfuric acid. Let's look at the last one. Nitric acid will react with what? Metal carbonate to form magnesium nitrate. So they call it metal carbonate, so you should know definitely there must be carbonate there. It has been said there is a metal carbonate. So all you need to provide is which metal. So now look at the product formed, the salt formed. You can see that the metal in the product formed is magnesium. So that means carbonate has been provided here from the table and magnesium has been provided in the product. So that makes it a very easy guess for you to know it's magnesium carbonate. Now let's quickly review. Anytime acid react with carbonate, what do we expect? What product to be formed? Well, I just wrote the sample of this in this particular one given, the example given. So I just picked one. When this is about zinc carbonate reacting with hydrochloric acid. So generally when metal carbonate reacts with an acid, three products will be formed. A salt will be formed, like in this case zinc chloride is formed, carbon dioxide will be formed, and water will be formed. So the type of salt can change, but carbon dioxide gas and water will never change anytime acid reacts with a metal carbonate. So let's take note of that while I produce with this question. So the first one says, okay, now that you form zinc chloride as a salt, how do you get a pure sample of it? How do you make it free from mixtures or impurities? So this question do come out very well, so you need to pay very good attention here. The method is this. First of all, you filter. Are you following the trend? Let me try to make something like an acronym here that can help us remember. So you filter, that's F. After filtration, what happens next? You evaporate. You make it evaporate. Let me call it E. Evaporation means putting it on the fire inside the evaporating dish in order to lose the water or to make the water escape from the solution by a process we call what? Evaporation. And the last one will be the crystallization. So please remember these processes. Sometimes you may need to dry the crystal in between filter papers. So remember FEC. I think that summarizes the entire process. Even though two marks are needed here to score the 2 marks, 2 answers, are needed here to score the 2 marks, but we have about 3 here. Let's go to number 11. The question is about energy conservation. So for energy conservation, one thing that should quickly come to the mind is the law of conservation. So law of conservation of energy shows that energy cannot be created or destroyed. That is what is most important. It can only be converted from one form to another, from kinetic energy to gravitational potential energy, from chemical energy to maybe heat energy. Okay, so energy can be converted, but it can never be lost. So that means that total energy input should be total energy output. So you need to remember that total energy input should be equal to the total energy output. Let me just keep it down somewhere here. Okay. Total energy input must be, not may be, equal to the total energy output. So please let's try to remember this. So if that is the case, let's look at the diagram we have here. The total energy input here is 80. So what is the output? The output comes in 2 forms. Some parts have already been converted to heat, whereas some other parts are transferred into the light energy. So the total output, remember, must be equal to the total input. So if the light energy is taking 60 joules, that means the heat energy must take the remaining joules, which is 20. I hope that is a bit clear for us. So the next question, number 12, is about mass extinction. One thing you need to know is the mass extinction happens suddenly. Now, one of the causes is collision by massive asteroid. It happens sometimes historically by research, sometimes ago, that's about 65 million years ago. And the moment it happens, it doesn't take millions more years for some organisms to be to go into extinction. In the case of a dinosaur, that same year, within the space of the collision, that same year when the collision happened, most of them are wiped out of the generation of existence. So it happened that same year. It's not, extended to another millions of years. So please take note of that as we proceed to the next question, question 13. This is about natural selection. Natural selection it happens naturally, where some features are passed from parent to offspring. It happens over generations, and then it involves survival of organisms that have better features that make them adapt better, survive better, and live on. Those that are less privileged or having the adaptation that give them limitations are wiped out of existence. So please remember that while we move on. The first question says, what are differences in characteristics between individuals of the same species? There are differences in characteristics between individuals of the same species. Okay, that is called variation. I think I need to note that here. Okay, this is called variation. So that is the first thing that happens in the natural selection. Variation appears among living organisms. Some are tall, some are short, some are fast, some are more muscular, more energetic, some are less energetic, and so on and so forth. So we now know that those that have better features that make them better adapted will live on, survive, reproduce, pass on their allele to their next generation, and then the next generations continue to remain those that are better suited. So characteristics are controlled by what? By genes. If you have written allele, you can also be correct. Okay, so alleles can also be written. So that's how you got your 2 marks. The second question, B, natural selection still. Where we have ideas that involve characteristics. Okay, it happens randomly. New characteristics that best fit the environment. Okay, they're trying to describe the entire process of natural selection. So the first question says we should tick to show if these results support the theory of natural selection, and then we should give a reason. What's the theory? Okay, they've given those theory there, right? So scientists use CRISPR plants to do their findings, and they say some characteristics never change. Yes or no? Okay, we're coming back there. Damage to genetic material for some characteristics repairs very quickly, so the characteristics do not change. Is it true? It can be a yes, it can be a no. It depends on the answers you give. It will be a no. If you try to consider the fact that characteristics can change randomly, of course it's possible, and then the changed one are passed from generation to generation. That can happen by mutation. Okay, that's what we call mutation. But if you consider the fact that characteristics stay the same, and if it's natural selection and doesn't change and it's passed on to the next generation, it can be a yes. So please take note of that. Any of the answers will be right, and that is it. The second question is about scientists getting further information about their study. What can they do? So the question is, suggest how the scientists get further information to help their study. They can get other information from research they do on the internet. They can get from different sources, maybe from the media, and so on and so forth. All right, so hold on, please. So now we can proceed to the next question. This question 14. So this is a reaction between metal and acid. Generally, something you need to know about a metal reacting with acid is this. Anytime metal reacts with acid, 2 products will be formed. These products are salts, sorry, yes, these products will be salts and hydrogen, although that does not happen for all kinds of metals. So I will only call your attention to the fact that most of the metals will be higher than hydrogen in the reactivity series. I hope you remember. So remember this general formula about reaction of metal with acid. And like I said, the metals must be higher than hydrogen in the reactivity series. So let's go on. May I react certain metals, okay, ribbon of magnesium, okay, with dilute acid and so on and so forth. One of the things you can read them off from the diagram. So the question is, Meyer finds that magnesium powder has a greater rate of reaction than a piece of magnesium ribbon. Explain why. These are 2 marks, of course 2 responses. So the first thing you need to remember is that magnesium powder has larger surface area. So that means more particles are exposed at a time. And then that means there are more collision. Telling you that there is greater rate of reaction already should explain to you that there is greater collision. And let me also remind us that the reason why our women at the kitchen squash the Maggi into the soup when they are preparing soup, is because they have this idea of the fact that a squashed Maggi will dissolve faster than dropping the cube inside the soup directly. So they have the knowledge of the fact that powdery form of Maggi, which has larger surface area, react faster. I hope that explains and makes it a bit logical. So let's go to the next question. The next question says we should use particle model to explain what happened when the magnesium reacts with the acid. Well, one thing you need to know is there is no way they will tell you to use a particle model and then you won't make mention of to the particles. Now, you should start talking about the particles at the original state, what happened thereafter, how did they produce the products, how did they form the products. So, anytime chemical reaction is happening, especially when it's going faster, one thing you should know is that the particles are gaining more energy, especially kinetic energy. You remember kinetic energy is the energy that has to do with movement. So as they are moving more, reacting more kinetic energy is formed and then more collision is taking place. And that is why we form the products. I think this question is clear enough. Question 15. We have a reaction between, we have a ruler being used to generate what we call a water wave. Water wave and the light wave you used to know are still similar. So the method, the bringing of water wave does not at all change what light wave is all about. So here, we are trying to, the question is about what happens to the frequency of the waves. When they say that Blessing makes the number of waves produced per second to increase, that is exactly the definition of frequency. So that means frequency is increasing. Okay? So the next question is about the diagram of a wave. We are meant to put that arrow to identify the amplitude. So amplitude is either the crest or the trough, as you can see in that diagram. The upper displacement from the mean position is called the crest, and the lower displacement from the mean position is called the trough. So let's get used and remember these terms. Let's get used to these terms and remember them. So question number 16 is about the formation of the moon. Well, if you are very used to what happens and how moon is formed, you know that it happens as a result of collision of the Earth with some smaller planets. So that is the only true and correct answer here. The next question is trying to analyze the rocks from the moon, and thousands of rocks were analyzed. Then it says, suggest why a large number of moon rocks were analyzed. Why do scientists need to, go for large samples during investigation? The same reason, to ensure the data or the result is more reliable. Okay? Then to have wide range of observation. Then to remove anomalous result, because there could be anomalous result, like you saw in the graph we just dealt with. So that is the end of question number 16. Now question number 17 is about electrical circuit. Circuit is one question that I'm almost very certain will come out in your exam. So you need to review the diagram of different components of the circuit. You need to know how to place them. You need to know the differences between circuits in parallel and in series. And you need to know what happens to the current in these two different types of circuits. In series, the current is the same everywhere, all over, because there is no division, no branching of the current, or no branching of the flow of current. But in the case of parallel, there is always a branching, a division of the current, so the current can reduce when it branches. So we'll just take note of that. So we have an incomplete diagram here. We are told to complete the diagram by adding two things, to add the current and to add the voltage. Now, current is having a symbol of I. Current has a quantity called I. It has I as quantity, yes, and A as unit. So you need to be very, very careful when you are writing the symbol for current. Don't go and use I. It is actually A. The symbol is A. A means ammeter. So you need to remember that. Ammeter, sorry, it means ampere. And then you need to know that it is measured in ammeter. So please remember all this about current, because students do confuse this part together. So that's why I have to emphasize it very well. So voltage is usually connected across a component. Voltage is usually connected across a component. Across means parallel. Parallel to a component. So when I say a component, it can be the bulb, like the one we are talking about here. It can be some other components or gadgets. So please take note of that. And that is the end of that question A. Question B is about Yusuf trying to make observation that lamp gets hot when current passes through them. So suggest what Yusuf does to make the investigation safe. Okay. He said the lamp gets hot over time. Okay. So what do you think he can do to prevent this hotness that is so much and can burn somebody's hand? So he can try to switch off the switch, to put off the switch when it's not using it, or to use smaller currents so that it won't be too hot. Okay, that's one of the ways you can solve that problem. Then the last question is about Yusuf making a hypothesis that the current to the lamp changes when the lamp gets hot. Is it true? Suggest how Yusuf investigates his hypothesis. How do you suggest he can do that? It's about measuring the current in the lamp when it's not yet connected. That time is cold, and when it's eventually connected over time, that time is hot. So you can then compare the current before and the current after. I hope this helps your revision session. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a nice day. And I wish you a huge success in your upcoming exam. Bye. See you with huge grade after your exam. Bye.